Good morning, everyone. Welcome to IHR Australia's webinar. In today's session, we are exploring the topic Meeting Positive Duty Obligations, a practical guide for government leaders. My name is Manasa Visakai. I am the content producer here at IHR Australia. I will be your host for today. Before we welcome our expert, I would like to highlight what we do here at IHR Australia. At IHR, we work with organizations to manage people risk, those challenges that can affect performance, culture, and compliance. We've been supporting clients for over 25 years, partnering with business leaders, HR teams, and boards to support both proactive planning and interventions to address issues. What sets us apart is our ability to balance legal considerations with a human centered, pragmatic approach. We work across four core service areas. First, our workplace investigations and mediation service. When issues arise, we provide fair, defensible investigation and expert mediation to help you resolve conflicts and rebuild trust within your teams. Second, our workplace training programs. We deliver scenario based, practical training to equip your leaders and teams with the tools to manage risk, lead well, and foster a respectful workplace. Third, compliance and risk advisory. This includes psychosocial risk assessments, wage compliance reviews, and broader governance support, helping you meet your legal obligations and embed best practice. Finally, HR consulting. We help organizations design strong people strategies, solve workforce challenges, and build cultures where performance and accountability thrive. So, whether you're managing a current issue or strengthening existing practices, our core expertise lies in managing people risk. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. In today's webinar, we are exploring Meeting Positive Duty Obligations, a practical guide for government leaders. Now, without further ado, I would like to take you all through what we will be covering today. To start off, what do positive duty obligations encompass? And what are the 7 standards? Following this, we'll be looking at some key risk factors or considerations that make compliance especially critical for government leaders. Then we'll also be looking at some recent case studies, what happened, the consequences, and key lessons when non-compliance occurs. Finally, we'll be looking at what are the most effective practical strategies for leaders to implement to ensure compliance. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our expert, Bronwyn Dennis, Senior Consultant, Training and HR Solutions. Hello, Bronwyn. How are you doing today?
Hi, Manasa. Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much. Bronwyn, we've been doing these webinars for a long time now. I would still like for you to give us a little bit of an introduction into what is it that you do at IHR Australia and your experience for our attendees.
Thanks, Manasa. Yes, I've been working for IHR for a couple of years now, principally providing training using that reality-based theatre that you talked about around a whole range of performance and leadership subjects, including respect in the workplace, leading respect in the workplace. We run training on managing everyday performance, having crucial conversations, general leadership, and developing leadership skills. I also provide some of those services that you spoke about in the consulting space, cultural audits and reviews. My background is primarily New South Wales government, which is why I'm happy today that we have a session aimed at our government leaders. Worked in the New South Wales public sector across a range of different clusters, working in HR, in change management, in organisational development and design, in business operations and business improvement. So as I said, really keen to make sure that, and we do make sure our programs are relevant for a range of industries, including the government sector.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Bronwyn. Now, before we dive into our questions, I would like to take a slightly different approach in today's webinar. I think it would be really valuable to see what the positive duty obligations look like in practice. We're going to start off by watching a short scenario that demonstrates what can go wrong when positive duty obligations aren't understood or taken seriously. We have two of our wonderful professional actors joining us today, Mark and Emma. Please take it away.
Thanks for meeting with me, Mark. I just wanted to talk about something that's been bothering me for a while.
Okay, yeah, shoot.
I've noticed in the team meetings there's been some behaviour from Ben that worries me. He constantly talks over me in meetings, and when I call it out, he laughs and makes jokes about how women aren't really cut out for certain projects or about women being too emotional for leadership.
Okay. Is he just joking around though? I mean, I thought you and Ben were friends.
Well, sure, we're friendly, but that doesn't mean he should be saying things like that. I mean, it's not okay.
Okay, I get that, but you know, I haven't heard anyone else complain. Brenda and Sue haven't said anything to me.
I'm not sure why that makes a difference. It makes me uncomfortable, and then I don't want to speak up in meetings.
I don't know. I mean, it's just how the team jokes around. I mean, it's not meant to be personal. Don't you think you might be overthinking it a bit?
I don't think that's fair. It makes me feel like I'm not being taken seriously. I don't feel safe speaking up anymore. When Ben makes those comments and everyone laughs, including you sometimes, it feels like I'm the problem.
Safe? Come on. I mean, Emma, no one's threatening you. Ben's not a bad guy. You're reading too much into this.
When I'm constantly interrupted, it makes me feel like I don't belong here.
See, look, I hear you, but really, I think you need to develop a bit of a thicker skin. And frankly, if you escalate this, it could make the work environment awkward for everyone.
So if I do report this formally, you think it will make things awkward? Well, for me or for Ben?
For the team. Look, we've got a big project coming up. We need everyone focused and getting along. I'd hate to see this blow up into something bigger. Let's move past this, okay?
Thank you, Mark and Emma. Bronwyn, Mark's response demonstrates several critical failures in understanding what it is to meet those positive duty obligations. What were your thoughts on this scenario?
Yeah, look, Mark really hasn't responded well in that situation, has he? Firstly, he hasn't really understood that the behaviour that Emma's experienced might meet that definition of sex-based harassment. He's dismissing it as banter or not serious. He hasn't taken any steps at all to resolve the situation. Our positive obligation makes us, means we have to take reasonable steps to both prevent and respond to harassment. So doing nothing is definitely not an option. And he hasn't really listened to Emma when she's telling him that the behaviour that she's experiencing has had an impact on her. He's really looking at the situation from his own perspective. He's viewing it through his lens of not thinking the behaviour is anything more than, harmless joking. So yes, a number of elements there where Mark has failed in his duty of care, as we would say, to Emma there.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I think it would be good if we could just dive into what do these positive duty obligations encompass and what are the 7 standards?
Yeah, thanks, Mana. So look, under the positive duty, under the Sex Discrimination Act, it requires employers to take reasonable and proportionate steps to eliminate, as far as practical, sex discrimination, sexual harassment, sex-based harassment, conduct that contributes to a hostile workplace, and victimisation. What this means in a practical sense is that it's no longer enough for us as managers or for us as organisations to just respond to an incident or a report after it happens. Organisations need to take proactive steps to ensure that their workplace culture prevents those behaviours from happening in the first place. So the Australian Human Rights Commission have released guidelines for organisations on how they can meet that positive duty or that positive obligation, and it encompasses 7 standards or 7 steps. The first of those 7 standards is senior leadership, so that senior leaders understand their obligations, role model the behaviours, and ensure that both prevention and response measures are implemented and regularly reviewed. The second is culture. So ensuring that our workplace culture is one that is safe for people, that values safety, respect, inclusion and accountability. The third is knowledge. So making sure that people are aware of the policies, have education, training, so that they understand what behaviour is expected of them in the workplace, but they also understand what counts as unlawful conduct. So we saw there in the scene from Mark that he may well not have that knowledge of what behaviour might be unlawful. The fourth step, is risk management, so that organisations treat unlawful conduct in the organisation as both an equality and a health and safety risk, and take a risk-based approach to prevention and response. The fifth standard is making sure there is support in place for people, ensuring that there is accessible trauma-informed support for people who are be that experiencing or witnessing some of those behaviours happening in the workplace. The sixth is reporting and response, making sure that we have multiple pathways for people to be able to raise issues, making sure that there are timely, consistent responses that both minimise harm and reduce victimisation. And then finally, making sure as organisations that we monitor, evaluate, and have transparency over what's happening within our workplace cultures, so that we collect and use data to understand what is happening for people. Often people won't formally report these behaviours. So again, it is on us both as managers and organisations to be regularly reviewing and conscious of what's happening within our organisations. Also, whilst not under the Sex Discrimination Act and not always necessarily referred to as positive obligation, under our model W.H.S Act and all of the supporting regulations that we have in various jurisdictions, organisations must also ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of their workers. They have to be, create safe workplaces for their employees, and that includes both psychological and psychosocial health as well as physical health. So since 2023, WHS regulations across most jurisdictions identify psychosocial hazards as bullying, sexual harassment, aggression, and a number of sorts of job risk factors. And these also must be eliminated and minimised. And so again, in practice, what this means is we have a positive duty to create and maintain psychologically safe workplaces, not just respond after incidents happen.
That framework is really comprehensive, Bronwyn, and I think it's a great start to just understand what these obligations mean. And it's also clear that meeting these standards require genuine commitment and resources from leadership. However, while these obligations apply to all employers, I know many of our attendees today are from government agencies. So Bronwyn, I think it'll be really valuable to them if we explore those key risk factors that make compliance especially critical for government leaders.
Yeah, look, obviously under both the Sex Discrimination Act and those WHS regulations, everyone conducting a business or enterprise has obligations. So the obligation itself isn't different, but sometimes, and as for those of us that have worked in government, we recognise this, sometimes the expectation on government agencies is higher. Now, there's a whole range of reasons for this, but some of those include that concept around visibility and public trust. You know, what we do in government is highly visible. Any sort of failures or any issues that happen will attract both, political and public and media attention. And so if we don't handle situations well, if we have concerns or issues happening with our workplace, that can damage that trust. There's a higher duty of care. Sometimes the expectations on government agencies, public sector leaders often, they're accountable to their employees, but to both public and statutory standards around equality and inclusion as well. The nature of the services that we deliver in government can be quite complex. We have people working in regulatory agencies, we have people working in client-facing situations, we have people working in custodial roles, we have people working in health and education, and sometimes those workforces create a higher risk for our employees of experiencing those behaviours. And then there's also then the complexity of accountability or governance across government. We have agencies sitting within clusters, we have contracted workforce, often we have outsourced service providers. And so all of those sorts of things can increase risk if we're not clear around the roles and controls in place that we have to manage some of those behaviours.
Thank you, Bronwyn. And those points that you highlighted are critical, especially about visibility and accountability in the public sector. It sounds like while the obligations are universal, the expectations and consequences can be quite different depending on the sector. So I wanted to, explore a little bit about how these positive duty obligations differ between public and private sectors. And is it just about expectations, or are there legal differences as well?
Yeah, so again, the legal duty under the obligations applies to both public and private employers. That core obligation, if you like, to take reasonable and proportionate steps to eliminate unlawful conduct is the same. But while the core legal obligation is the same, how the duty is met in practice differs across sectors according to size, nature, and resources within the organisations. So under the Sex Discrimination Act and those WHS regulators, they assess compliance through, I guess, what you would call a scaled lens. And that lens of what is reasonable will differ depending on things like the size, nature, and circumstances of the business or the undertaking, the resources available, and they're talking about both financial and human resources available, the practicability and cost of implementing some of those measures, and the degree of risk and potential harm to the employees. So given the size of a lot of public sector agencies, the access to resources that they have, that expectation of what is a reasonable response is likely to be higher. Some of those factors that might create that higher expectation around our response are similar to some of the reasons why we might have that different obligation. Again, so that additional statutory or regulatory response that's required. We have public sector codes of conduct, FOI and transparency, freedom of information and transparency obligations, means there might be a higher expectation around things like accountability, reporting and transparency. Again, as we mentioned, there's operational differences. So there's actually potentially a higher risk profile in some of those organisations around things like interactions with the public, interactions with people experiencing our services through health or custodial settings. And so those reasonable and proportionate measures will differ. And then, of course, enforcement powers. So the political and reputational consequence of us having an enforcement or a remedy given to us by the courts, might mean that there is a greater focus on making sure we have met those obligations.
So what I'm hearing, Bronwyn, is that the legal duty is the same, but what's considered reasonable and proportionate is scaled based on different factors. So thank you so much for clarifying this. Before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to check in with our audience if you're all still here with us today. And one way you can do this is by submitting some of your questions in the Q&A box below, because we do have a devoted audience questions segment later in today's session where we'll be able to pick a couple of questions and our expert Bronwyn will be able to answer them. So wonderful, Bronwyn. Now back to theory is one thing, but I think it's valuable to our participants today if we took a look at what's actually happening in workplaces and in the courts. Can you share some recent case studies that show us what happens when organizations don't meet these obligations?
Yeah, one of the first cases that's made its way through the court system since the change to the sex discrimination is Margar versus Khan. Now, people may have seen this in the media or have read this as known it as the Mad Mex case. So it involved an employee working for a franchise, a Mad Mex franchise. Now, the employee in that case was awarded a record $305,000 in damages. The judge finding that there had been sexual harassment, victimisation, and they were awarded aggravated damages. The allegation of sex-based harassment, which again was one of the first considerations of this, wasn't upheld. But in that case, Justice Bromwich noted that the behaviour of management and of the male co-workers within the workplace had provided grounds for the escalation of poor behaviour, which eventually led to that much more serious conduct of sexual harassment, which was upheld in the case. The judge in that case noted that the culture constituted overt and outspoken sexist behaviour and was tolerant to that behaviour within that workplace environment. Aggravated damages were awarded because of how poorly Mad Mex and Mr. Khan responded to the complaint. There was actually a finding of victimisation against the employee and how the organisation had responded to the person making a complaint. So some of the takeaways of this case, I think, is that there is definitely a escalating damage trend coming through the courts. Whilst this was a record 305, it followed not long ago. There was another case in New South Wales where there was around about $280,000 in damages awarded. So there is that escalating damages claims coming out. That failure to act within organisations, creates that risk of financial penalties. If we victimise or retaliate against our employees, if we allow that to happen within the workplace, there is an increased risk of findings against us. And of course, we need to make sure that those high risk environments, so in the government case, that might be employees experiencing those behaviours from the public in addition to their colleagues. But in this case, it was a franchise, a small business workplace. There were significant power imbalances. There was a migrant visa holder in arrangement there between the employee and the manager. Means that we need urgent and proactive controls to be put in place where we do have that increased risk. There's another recent case, I guess, where WorkSafe Victoria have recently charged an organisation, Beechworth Holiday Park, and its director. That one's still working its way through the courts, but the charges that were made against that organisation allege that the company failed to provide a safe workplace, exposing a worker to risk of psychological injury and sexual harassment. And specifically in that case, WorkSafe asserts that the company did not create or enforce a policy addressing appropriate workplace behaviour and failed to train their staff in what those behaviours look like. Now, in that case, the director is personally charged with failing to take reasonable care and ensure safety within the workplace. So again, it'll be interesting to see what that outcome is. Given the changes are fairly new, that positive obligation is still yet to be extensively tested through the court system. But there is an older case that I just want to refer to that sort of points to that risk of organisations not being proactive in establishing that safe workplace. So there's a fairly recent Fair Work case. Unfair dismissal claims were brought by 2 employees against Ventia that to me highlight that risk that we have, particularly around things like having a sort of tick and flick approach to training, maybe not meeting that employer obligation to educate staff around workplace bullying and sexual harassment in this case. So in this case, the 2 employees had posted inappropriate material. Actually, there was 3 employees, but took the Fair Work action, had posted inappropriate material on a Facebook site group. They called that group Sickos Sharing Videos. The sorts of materials that were shared included things like pornography, racist and sexist, memes, cartoons, content, those sorts of things. The Facebook group was a private group, but it did include other employees from the company within that group. Now, Commissioner Reardon was the commissioner in that case, and he was quite critical of the adequacy of Ventia's training on things like social media use, bullying, and sexual harassment. And he referred to their training approach as superficial, self-paced, tick and flick method that lacked the depth and effectiveness of face-to-face training. He noted that sort of having online modules where we have 100+ slides that staff work their way through really does not achieve the same educational outcome as having interactive, instructor-led sessions. The Respect at Work guidelines really do support this as well. They recommend that sexual harassment training be immersive, interactive, and led by qualified instructors. You know, e-learning certainly has a place, and it can be convenient and cost-effective to deliver, but it can be limited in its ability to prevent harassment in the workplace. Often that face-to-face training gives us the opportunity for people to ask the what if. What if this happens in the workplace? What if I say this to somebody? What if that sort of happens? And so it really does give us that opportunity to explore some of that nuance around workplace behaviour, particularly in our multi-generational, multicultural workplace environments where sometimes people's intent might not be experienced in the way that they meant it. So that more immersive training can certainly provide a lot more context for employees around what behaviour is acceptable and what behaviour isn't acceptable.
Thank you, Bronwyn. And I think the cases that you highlighted today, they did really underline the real world consequences of getting this wrong from both a financial and a workplace culture standpoint. But let's bring our professional actors back and take a look at the flip side. Earlier, we saw Mark handle Emma's concern poorly, but now I would like for us to see how that same conversation could have gone if Mark did understand his obligations. So let's pay attention to what he does differently this time.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for meeting with me. I just wanted to bring up something that's been happening for a while. Look, it's about Ben. He keeps interrupting me in meetings, and when I call it out, he makes jokes about women not being suited for certain projects or that women are too emotional for leadership. Yeah.
Emma, look, I'm sorry to hear that this has been happening to you. I mean, I want to assure you that kind of behaviour really is not okay. So thanks for bringing it to my attention. Can I just touch base with you? How's this making you feel?
Well, it's extremely frustrating, and it just makes me feel less confident speaking up in the meetings.
Well, yeah, that would be completely frustrating, and it's not okay, Emma. I just want to assure you of that. And I also want to let you know that myself and the team, we absolutely value your contributions. I think you bring a great perspective to a lot of the conversations, and if anything is making you feel uncomfortable speaking up, it needs to be addressed. Can I just ask, have you spoken to Ben about his behaviour? Have you said anything to him?
Well, I did. I tried, but he just made another stupid joke.
Okay, well, that's no good. I have noticed a bit of joking around in the team, but I didn't realise it was impacting you to this degree. Look, I have some thoughts about how to approach this, but I want to make sure we're on the same page about what would help. What would be a good outcome for you? What would make you feel supported?
Look, I don't want to make a big thing out of it, but he just really needs to understand that those attitudes aren't okay.
Sure, I mean, that's completely reasonable. Okay, look, firstly, let's check in with HR so that they can go through what support options are available to you. Okay, and then I'm going to have an informal chat with Ben to make sure he understands this kind of behaviour is not okay. Even if he thinks he's joking, he needs to be aware that it has an impact on people around him. I also think it'd be a good idea to have a chat with the team more generally, not singling anyone out, about how we engage with each other in a way that aligns with our team values and allows everyone to be included.
Okay. Yeah, that does make me feel a lot better.
Great. Well, let's do that. We can see whether things improve over the next few weeks, and I'll check back in at our next catch-up to see how you're feeling.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Wow, what a difference, right? Mark's approach in this scenario really embodied several of the standards we discussed today, Bronwyn, particularly around leadership, support, and reporting mechanisms. And creating that workplace where managers consistently respond like this doesn't happen by accident. So, Bronwyn, what were your thoughts on this situation?
Yeah, look, certainly there, the manager, Mark, recognises and acknowledges the risk early. So he immediately labels the behaviour as not okay. And, this sort of is acknowledging or showing there his positive obligation to both identify and respond to those psychosocial risks, not minimise or rationalise them. He's taken proportionate, reasonable steps to support the employee, so checking in with HR, informally having a conversation with Ben, and reinforcing those sort of respectful team norms. So he's balancing their support with the individual, checking in with her where she's comfortable with that response, but then also taking that preventative action at the team level. And then finally making sure that he is conscious about the employee's psychological safety. So checking in with her to monitor how she's feeling, acknowledging that it's not just a one and done. We don't just have a conversation and then never check back in to see how the employee's feeling, whether those behaviours are still happening in the workplace. So certainly a better outcome there from the manager second time around.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for unpacking that. I think we've also covered a lot of ground today. So I wanted to just ask you to take us through some of the most effective and practical strategies that you would recommend for leaders to ensure compliance, but also create that kind of supportive culture.
Yeah, look, a lot of the strategies will obviously just come through via that sort of 7 standards that we talked earlier. But the first is leadership and governance, right? We need to make sure that as an organisation, we have a prevention plan. Again, these things don't just happen by accident. So we need to, be aware of what's happening within our workplaces, endorse a prevention plan. We might need, or it might be appropriate to get board or minister sign off on that. Make sure there is resourcing attached to that plan, that there is clear accountabilities. People are aware of who's going to deliver some of those strategies that will help create that positive workplace, meet that positive obligation, and make sure that we embed that positive duty obligation into our governance reporting. I think the key there for me for that approach is also making it visible, right? Don't just write these plans and put them on a shelf or put them on the internet. We need to talk about it. We need to make sure that that support for creating that safe workplace free from discrimination, harassment, and bullying is visible. We need to make sure that we have the policy training and that capability development as a focus. So making sure that we have clear, plain language policies on respectful conduct and incident handling, including what the outcomes and consequences might be for some of that behaviour. And I do just want to say about this, and again, if there's any HR professionals on board, I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, but often we put language or phrases in documents. Often we do, approach that from a compliance perspective. We use language that's in legislation, all of those sorts of things. But it's really important, and again, this would be dependent very much on the nature of the workplace, that we put colour and language around those words, that we talk about specific behaviours and situations that might be relevant to that workplace. And we're very clear where that line is between behaviour that is okay and not okay. We also need to make sure that the training and support and tools that we provide people is role specific, particularly compared for our managers and our leaders to our staff, because we need to focus on what their responsibilities, their obligations are from a response perspective. We also need to make sure that our training for staff includes both how they can personally respond or try and resolve situations, but how they might be able to step in as a bystander to support a colleague where they see some of that behaviour happening. The third is making sure, again, focusing on that risk-based approach, that we treat both harassment, bullying, and that hostile workplace, an environment that's hostile on the grounds of sex, as a psychosocial hazard. So making sure that we have risk assessments in place, again, particularly where we might have employees or groups of employees that face that greater risk of experiencing these behaviours. There is a range of risks that do, or a range of characteristics that do create greater risk for some people, and making sure that we implement proportionate controls to address those risks. And that could be a whole range of things around design, rostering, supervision, client interaction protocols, all of those sorts of things, and linking that risk-based prevention to your, WHS governance or your audit and risk procedures. Again, accessible reporting and safe response, making sure that people have multiple pathways to raise issues, to raise concerns. So anonymous, informal, independent, even external reporting where that might be appropriate. Making sure that we have service level agreements in place for response times, that we have a clear, threshold for when we deal with matters informally versus where we might escalate them to more formal or external investigations would be, really important. And then making sure that we do put the person at the centre. So making sure that we do provide support to people that may experience or witness these behaviours, having access to EAPs, to counselling and support, safety assessments and risk, regardless again of whether they want to pursue a formal response or not. And then the last one would be that having that oversight of what's happening within your organisation. So the data, making sure that you're collecting a range of data, not just on things like incidents, but just again, making sure you have data on where there might be those higher risks within the workplace. Publicising with internally your sort of anonymized trends, and then using the findings from some of those situations that you might have to refine your interventions, to refine your training, to refine your response protocols.
Those are really actionable strategies that you've provided for our attendees today, Bronwyn. Thank you. Now that we've covered a lot of great questions today, from the legal framework to real world case studies and practical solutions, I think it's time if we move to our audience Q&A segment. So we do have some submissions from our registration form. So as you can see on the slide, these are the questions that were submitted to us. So we will be prioritizing these questions. And for anyone in our attendees, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. So Bronwyn, let's get started with the first question, where one of the attendees had asked us about some of the latest trends and issues after implementing positive duty actions.
Yeah, obviously, as we say, it's fairly new obligation, so hard to draw a lot of trends from the cases and things that are working through. But the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, just recently did their annual data collection. Some of you online might have participated in that. So they did that in 2024, and they collected data from over 7,000 medium and large employers, that covering around about 5 million Australian workers. And they were collecting data to assess that sort of workplace sexual harassment prevention and response measures. And that initiative aligns with the recommendation of the Respect at Work report, which advocates that shift from a sort of policy-only approach to a more proactive, evidence-based strategy in addressing workplace sexual harassment. Now, the findings revealed that nearly all organisations have a formal policy on sexual harassment and discrimination, which is fantastic. 99% of organisations have a policy. So great to see. However, only one quarter, about 28%, sorry, not only one quarter, 28% of organisations don't monitor the prevalence of the incidents happening within their organisation. So there's also a bit of a gap that the WGA sort of acknowledged or recognised, that there's a bit of a gap in how leaders are responding to sexual harassment or sex discrimination, and making sure that those company leaders understand and promote the expectations of a safe, respectful and inclusive environment. The data in that report also highlighted some other areas that they believe require further attention from organisations, including that need for improved leadership accountability, comprehensive training programs, and effective monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. There is a case that I just wanted to talk about there. It's an older case, much older case, so well before these positive obligations. But it was a case against Australia Post, actually, in Melbourne, where an employee put in a race discrimination claim against the organisation. So a little bit different, but again, similar outcome that I want to talk about here. The justice in that case, or the judge in that case, noted that the organisation had absolutely met all of their requirements around making sure that their employees understood their obligations. There was policies, there was comprehensive and extensive training. But what the judge found in that case, and they were quite scathing against Australia Post in that instance, was when somebody did make a complaint, the organisational response was severely lacking. So again, it's not just about training and education. Those are really important things, but it's making sure that we do respond appropriately when someone does raise an issue or a concern under that policy. Making sure when we do that training, as we said, that it is role specific to managers about, well, how do I have a conversation with someone when they raise an issue? Often people are a bit, conflict avoidant, not comfortable about how to respond. So again, it's great to have the policies and training in place, but we also need to make sure that as an organisation, we do respond appropriately when people do raise issues under those policies.
Thank you for responding to that question, Bronwyn. Before we move on with the second question, I did want to address two questions that we got in the Q&A box. In terms of getting the copy of the slide deck, yes, if you've registered to this webinar, you will be receiving the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck within a day, in a couple of days, basically. So I hope that is helpful. And thank you so much to one of the attendees who gave us a shout out saying that our webinar is engaging thanks to our professional actors as well as our expert. So Bronwyn, let's get moving with our Q&A section. One of the attendees asked us to provide some low-cost but effective ways to meet positive duty across employees and volunteers. This is interesting.
Yeah, look, effective positive measures don't have to be expensive, right? Like really, again, at the core, what we're trying to do is create safe workplaces for our employees that are free from discrimination, harassment, and bullying. And so one of the most critical things that we can do to start on that journey is make it clear what behaviours are and aren't acceptable, and what the consequences are of behaving or speaking in a way that is against those expectations. Now, that means making sure that our policies are up to date. As I said, use language that is meaningful for those employees. Use examples of behaviour that is relevant to those situations. Again, whether they're employees, contractors, volunteers, it doesn't matter. We still have that obligation to keep people safe. Make sure your codes of conduct or any sorts of arrangements that you have, say with volunteers, reference those behaviours. And again, as managers or as bystanders, we make sure that those unacceptable behaviours are called out. That is a cultural issue. That doesn't cost a lot of money. So to me, that's key. Workplace culture is key, I think. Certainly, I say this internally. For me, compliance starts with culture. And so as leaders within those organisations, being clear around what our culture is, what our expectations and values are around those behaviours and calling them out is a very low-cost way to start that journey of meeting our positive obligation. So some of the simple strategies that we might be able to use in those environments is, discussing the policies in team meetings, having a conversation with the team around how well do we think we're holding ourselves accountable to these policies. Using internal champions to reinforce those respectful behaviours, and providing access, making sure that our policies and our complaint procedures are accessible, visible. And again, as I said, leaders can role model those expected behaviours and check in regularly with their team to identify and mitigate any of those risks that their staff or volunteers might be experiencing. I think the key the key for me is both about consistency and reinforcement. Again, not just policies on a shelf.
Well said, Bronwyn. Thank you. The next question is quite interesting. The attendee wanted to understand how larger organizations can ensure compliance through training.
Yeah, look, I think we've sort of touched on this a couple of times throughout the session today. Large organisations certainly might be considered non-compliant if the employees aren't adequately trained in those core expectations. And that sort of, again, I get it, it's large organisations, people aren't necessarily sitting at desks, we have a very dispersed workforce, and that sort of online training can be a way that we sort of feel that we've covered the breadth of our organisation. But again, with large organisations that have access to resources, that regulatory and case law guidance is really emphasising that training needs to be meaningful and effective, not just tick and flick. So courts and regulators are very much expecting large organisations to provide that structured, interactive and evidence-based training to make sure that those employees understand their own obligations and can apply those standards. So failure to do that can certainly be seen as a breach of that positive duty obligation. We do have, obviously, our training here in IHR. I love the face-to-face training. I think it does give us that ability to really engage with people around what's happening specifically in their workplace to answer those questions. But we do provide that training in an online, online as well. Again, recognising that for some organisations, it's really difficult to get people all together in one physical space.
Yeah, definitely. And Bronwyn, in terms of the W.H.S obligations, we did touch on it a little bit at the start of our webinar. But the last question from our previously submitted questions talks about how organizations can ensure compliance, especially with the W.H.S obligations.
Yeah, look, as we've talked about, sexual harassment would certainly fall under what WHS regulators would look at as a psychosocial risk. So there's a lot of, for me, there is a lot of commonality across positive obligation under the Sex Discrimination Act and our duty of care to our employees under occupational health and safety regulations. So again, as recommended by the Australian Human Rights Commission, we really should be taking a risk-based approach to that health and safety, and that includes those psychosocial risks. So having clear policies, undertaking risk assessments, making sure there's staff consultation, providing that training, undertaking regular audits, making sure that we have those reporting mechanisms in place, all of those sorts of things. So I think the opportunity in meeting that compliance is that there's a real opportunity for organisations to integrate what has maybe in the past or traditionally or historically been seen as two separate functions. Sometimes safety fits under people and culture HR, sometimes it doesn't. But really, I think there's an opportunity here to bring those two parts of organisations, policy and approach together to make sure that we're integrating that sexual harassment prevention into that broader and psychosocial safety, of course, into that broader safety management system, utilising the existing frameworks and processes that we have to meet that risk assessment or to meet that risk approach.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I am looking at our Q&A box. We've got some really interesting questions. Considering that we have about 5 more minutes left on our webinar today, wanted to see if you could respond to this question where the attendee is asking, how do you recommend taking action when individuals report inappropriate workplace behaviors anonymously?
Yep.
Do the same obligations apply in such cases too?
Yeah, look, under the positive obligation, again, because we have that responsibility to prevent as well as respond, as soon as we become aware of something happening, whether we become aware of it because we've observed it, whether we become aware of it because it's been reported anonymously, we have a responsibility to do something. Now, that responsibility to do something doesn't necessarily mean, grievance or disciplinary action. That responsibility to do something is around creating that safe workplace. So even where we become aware of something anonymously, we have a responsibility to do something. Now, we saw in those scenes earlier from our actors that the manager said in his case, one of the actions he was going to take was to, without singling out the situation or the person, have a conversation with the team around how the team was holding themselves accountable to some of their values. So again, obviously it depends on the nature of the allegation. We do obviously need to be careful if we take individual steps against a person. People are entitled obviously to procedural fairness, and so it may be limited as to what action we can take where it's an anonymous report. Certainly though, if it was very serious, again, we would need to make sure that employees are safe. But just because somebody chooses to not identify themselves doesn't mean that we can't take action. And again, the primary focus is making sure that our employees are safe in that environment. And so the action that we can take might be informal, or where someone is at risk, we might need to take more formal steps in those situations. But just because a report is anonymous doesn't mean that we ignore it or don't respond. We still need to create that safe workplace.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I hope that answered your question. Moving on, I just had another question from our attendee. Bronwyn, you run a lot of our training programs. What are your thoughts around refresher training? If organizations need to do refresher trainings, what is the frequency do you recommend?
Yeah, look, I think obviously that's going to depend on a whole bunch of things around the nature of an organisation. I think refresher training is important. We often have people coming in and leaving our organisations, and so it's important to make sure that everybody's being trained across those behaviours and are aware of what the behaviours are. How often you run it might depend on things like what other things do you have in place to make sure people are aware of those behaviours. Do you regularly talk about them at all staffs? Do you have team meetings where maybe there's materials provided to managers at team meetings for them to regularly have those sorts of conversations? It might be you might need to do refresher training where there's a significant change in regulations. We certainly saw that coming out of the Respect at Work framework updates, the legislative updates, and often organisations use that as an opportunity to think about refresher training. You might decide that there needs to be refresher training because you're seeing an increase in grievances or an increase in safety risks. I think that if you are going to do refresher training where staff have already done that training in a fairly recent period, you might want to think about, well, how can we focus that training to be a little bit different so that people aren't just sitting through the same training session again, which might be a little bit counterproductive if they feel that training isn't necessarily meeting their specific requirements. So I think, yes, we do need to do refresher training because it needs to be a cycle of making sure that the whole organisation is using the same language, is aware of what the response frameworks are, is clear around that consistent workplace culture. But that frequency will very much depend on, as I say, how much of those other things might you have in place in your organisation.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think we are at that time, that hour of the webinar where we're supposed to be wrapping up. But before we do wrap up, Bronwyn, we did cover a lot of ground today, but is there one thing that you want to leave with our attendees today, a key takeaway for them perhaps?
I think the key takeaway, and actually sort of picked this up when I was looking at that WGEA report, is it can seem overwhelming. for organisations, big, small, volunteers, custodial, health, education, whatever it is. It can feel overwhelming. We saw that question there about, well, what can large organisations do about training? We saw other questions sort of pointing out, well, what about organisations where we have a lot of volunteers? I think the key takeaway for people is it's like that old meme about how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Just take a step. If the first thing that you do is sit down as an executive team to talk about your workplace culture, or the first thing that maybe the people in culture or safety department do is take the old policies down and sort of, run a lens across it to see how whether it might need updating to some of the new regulations. Just start to have the conversations. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think we say that perfection is the enemy of good. Just start on the journey.
Perfect. On that note, Bronwyn, thank you once again for taking the time to join us today. Your strategies and tips were extremely beneficial. The case studies clearly underline the consequences of non-compliance. And to our actors, thank you so much for taking the time to put forth such an impactful performance today. Your acting was extremely realistic, and it also highlighted a lot of the issues that organizations might be facing in their own workplaces. And to all our wonderful participants, thank you for taking part today and for staying till the very end. I hope everybody has a lovely day ahead. And if you do have any concerns or would like to speak to one of our experts, you can always visit our website or give us a call, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you to our wonderful